Today, I would like to concentrate on a fascinating article that you published last month on GnosticMedia.com, Manufacturing the Deadhead, a Product of Social Engineering, which gets into a fascinating field of research tying in Gordon Wasson and the CIA and MK Ultra and the creation of the 60s drug counterculture into a fascinating thesis. And it's difficult to summarize this, but one sentence that is particularly intriguing is that it says here, for example, the counterculture had been developed by elements within the US government and banking establishment as part of a larger plan to bring about a new dark age, or as it was marketed to potential victims, an archaic revival. And this gets into all sorts of fascinating fields of nooks and crannies of research. And you begin the article by talking about your research from last year showing that Gordon Wasson had been linked even in primary documents with the CIA. But I'm not sure if you want to start there, or perhaps we could start even further back talking about the actual origin of LSD, which is not what most people think it is.
Why don't we first discuss our last article for those who aren't familiar with it?
Well, just to begin, the real centerpiece of the manufacturing the deadhead was not so much the discovery of the letter that described Project 58's Subproject 58, MK Ultra Subproject 58's funding, but the understanding of who was the individual asking for the funds. And you were able to determine that it was Gordon Wasson, that there was absolutely no chance that it could be anyone else. And so that really, I think, is a good point to start that discussion. Is
it's called a list of institutional notifications, which is a list of, that's where I got J.P. Morgan National Philosophical Society. It's only about
talking about with regard to Subproject 58, the document that relates it to J.P. Morgan specifically.
Yeah, and now the thing I'm not really quite sure on is I'm not sure if I independently got Wasson's name. I mean, it's obvious it's him, or I just got that from the search firm of the Manchurian Candidate.
Now, with those files there that are in obviously Wasson's own writing, and they've got his New York 8, 23 Wall Street whited out there and his signature whited out, but it's pretty clear that it's him because only he was involved in 3 prior expeditions. So there's no other person that could have been, putting that together. Right. And so it's clear that it's Wasson. Is there any chance that those notes came from another fund that the CIA inserted in there? Or are those official part of MK Ultra Subproject 58?
No, they're definitely Subproject 58 documents.
Okay.
And he would gain an ally, Castaneda would gain an ally through ingesting datura and the psilocybin mushrooms. So that was how we hooked people, because people were already... The audience had been prepared for at least 15 years, going back to Aldous Huxley, and the mescaline ingestion that Huxley had gotten involved with back in, I think, 1953.
Surprise.
Then there was Wasson in 1957 with the publication about the Mazatec mushrooms.
When you go through the documents on Gordon Wasson, you see that he's working, and I went to... Princeton through the Mudd Library and pulled a lot of documents from the CFR archives there that show that Wasson was actually a chairman for the Council on Foreign Relations, and he's working with guys like Walter Lippmann. I pulled a document out of the U.S. Library of Congress that shows that Wasson was working with Edward Bernays, the father of propaganda, for at least a decade. And when you see all of the things tying together and the social engineering that Bernays was doing and what Wasson was doing, I think that they tie perfectly in together. And then, at the Hoover Institute up at Stanford, I found a letter from Wasson to Bertram Wolfe where he says essentially that he's asking Bertram Wolfe if he remembers the last letter to him, and he says, where I was asking you where Tolstoy had said that the printing press was a mighty engine for disseminating ignorance. And then he turns and says, and this Mazatec affair is a case in point. And this is just a week after he's published this big sob story in the New York Times where he's supposedly expressing all of this remorse in the newspaper about what he's done, even though he casts half the blame on Maria Sabina, who he set up by going through the mayor's office in the first place. And, you know, when he went to Maria Sabina's home, they thought it was official business, and that's the only reason why she talked to him at all, because the mayor showed up at her door and asked her to talk to Wasson. And so, you know, of course, Wasson casts half this blame on her, but you know, here Wasson, he creates the psychopaths and hippies, etc., that he complains about that descended on Hualta de Jimenez. But he turns around and complains about them when he's the very guy who created them by launching this entire psychedelic movement with the help of guys like Aldous Huxley. And interestingly, right, you know, Gordon Wasson, you know, I have numerous letters where Gordon Wasson, you know, between Wasson and, for instance, DCI Dulles, or Wasson and numerous other guys, where he's attempting to recruit them, or they are being recruited or brought in as members to the Century Club. The Century Club is, you know, basically it's an art association on the East Coast. It's actually, and I did a lot of research into it. It's basically a CIA front. Last week I was watching this movie on the Lincoln assassination, and interestingly, right in the middle of the plot is the Century Club. But so DCI Alan Dulles and Gordon Wasson appear to have been two head key figures there, and they bring in guys like Ellsworth Bunker, the ambassador to Vietnam, and you know, all of these other figures like George Keenan, Frank Ashtel, was a member of the CFR and a big banker. His son Arthur Ashtel was one of the guys who worked with Goldman Sachs up until 2002. You know, so there's all of these banking tie-ins there between Wasson and these other guys and the CFR and everything.
Then there was Wasson in 1957 with the publication about the Mazatec mushrooms, and then of course peyote and the Native American Church. People already knew about that. So all of these, and Jimson weed was well known, at least in California. There were American Indians in California still using it. So anyway, what Castaneda did was take this kind of interest in psychedelics and then take it out of its context in the United States and transpose it over to Mexico, which is exactly what Wasson had already done back in 1957.
You know, what's interesting is these people all seem to be very adept at public relations, you know, and Wasson obviously was trained by his close friend Edward Bernays, who is the father of propaganda.
You have, in the 60s, you have this combination of dance, music, and theater, movies, right? Yeah. And it's, you know, you have Easy Rider, you have all of the promotion of the drug culture, it comes out in all of these movies, a lot of them associated with people living in Laurel Canyon. You've got all this rock and roll music that suddenly pops up out of nowhere. Right. And then, of course, you have this collection of dancers called the Freaks, led by this guy Vito, who they always appear at all of these events and kind of help, you know, get the crowd into the mood of drug taking. It's all, you know, it's like if you look at what happened when these bands, the Byrds and the Doors, sort of appearing, you had the dance, this electronic sound, and you had the drug, right? Well, that's really interesting if you look at someone like Edward Bernays, okay, because Bernays, before he began his propaganda career in the War is Good department, where Wilson sent him during when World War I came about, where he worked with people who had specialized in social control. Before that, he had three separate projects. One was a play called Damaged Goods, which was the most highly sexualized play that had ever been presented in America. New York Times wrote a review of it calling it is now sex o'clock in America.
I was interested in all kinds of social affairs, not societal affairs, but social affairs that had to do with a better society. And so I wrote Bennett and said, the editors of the Medical Review of Review will be glad to support you in your effort to produce this play. because at that time there was a man in New York, Anthony Comstock, who fought anything having to do with anything that might be considered to be slightly off color. And venereal disease was more than off color. It couldn't be mentioned in any society, polite or otherwise.
Very bold undertaking for that period, really.
So I wrote to this actor, who was the father of Joan Bennett, whom you've seen on the screen, and signed it the editors. I'd learned that from the Atlantic Monthly, which always signed its letters the editors. And next morning there was a telephone call from Richard Bennett, will you come up to the Lambs Club and have lunch with me? I want to talk to the editors. And I said, I'm the editors. So I came up and had lunch with him. And after that lunch, I decided, and my associate, who was 22 years old, agreed, that we would organize the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund. We would charge $4 for admission to the fund, and that the $4 would give you the opportunity to see damaged goods performed by Richard Bennett and a company. And in order to build up this to have status in New York at the time, we got John D. Rockefeller Jr., who was interested in fighting venereal disease, and Abram Flexner and others to become members of the Medical Review of Reviews Sociological Fund. And before we knew it, this performance went on. And incidentally, I found out later by looking at the list of those who were present that Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor, were present.
We're both in the audience.
We're both in the audience. And this play, which was performed in New York at the Gaiety Theater, made such a terrific sensation that next day the newspapers were full of it, and one man sagely observed, "It has struck 6 o'clock in America." At this point...
What year was this?
1913.
Right. So very highly sexualized play. He brought out Enrico Caruso. He was actually Enrico Caruso's promoter and producer for his tour. And you have to remember, at this time, Caruso was very risque. You know, that was where the culture was. And then, moreover, his next event was he promoted the Russian dancer Nijinsky, who was like Polish extraction, but came from Russia, and he was famous for his risque outfits. And in an interview, Bernays said that he completely changed the attitude toward dance in America. Now, this is amazing because this all occurs before he's 22 years old. He's promoted these 3 events, all of them which, if you look forward...
And he was even offered a job as an editor for a medical journal or something.
Well, he was
like
that before
right.
that. And then from his role as an editor of medical, he started doing all these theatrical promotions. I mean, it was just amazing that he had this trajectory, and then went straight into the war is good department, creating propaganda for the country. But I'm just saying it's interesting if you look at the trajectory.
What's interesting is these people all seem to be very adept at public relations, you know, and Wasson obviously was trained by his close friend Edward Bernays, who is the father of propaganda. Terence McKenna admitted in an audio recording that he was a PR guy.
Well, I often, when asked this question, I've said, you know, it beats honest work. I mean, my brother is a PhD in 3 subjects and works in hard science, and I don't think it's brought him immense happiness, not that he's despondent, but I was always kind of a slider. You know, and certainly when I reached La Chirera in 1971, I had a price on my head by the FBI. I was running out of money. I was at the end of my rope. And then they recruited me and said, you know, with a mouth like yours, there's a place for you in our organization. And, you know, I've worked in deep background positions about which the less said, the better. And then, you know, about 15 years ago, they shifted me into public relations, and I've been there to the present.
You know, and of course, people don't get that a PR guy is a paid liar. And they'll say, well, you know, Terence McKenna liked to tell stories, and he was recruited by the mushroom. But get this, folks, somebody who is in propaganda, who is in public relations, is a paid liar there to fool you. A bard, if you look it up even on Wikipedia, it says someone who is hired by the king to tell the king's story.
Right.
You know, Terence McKenna went around all the time saying, I'm a bard.
Exactly. So he was advising the colonizers, like the British and the Dutch, to use the same strategy that the Russians had used in Siberia, to create a native revival and to reward them for whatever kind of trait that they had that they could exhibit and get the attention of the colonizer. And I think this is exactly what they did then later with the Mazatec and the Huichol and the Mayan. All of these waves, let's call them, waves of diverting American counterculture into Mexican Indians were predicated on the advice that Bateson gave back in 1944 of having a native revival, but I guess it got renamed later as the Archaic Revival. Is that what you understand?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it appears that Terence McKenna was familiar with all of this. And again, like I said, you know, Gregory Bateson working with MKUltra, working with Aldous Huxley, Wasson, etc. We know for sure with Huxley, I don't know if he and Wasson directly communicated. If they did, that would be huge. But then Terence McKenna takes this and remarkets it again as the Archaic Revival, which we discussed in our article, Manufacturing the Deadhead. So the theme here is neo-feudalism. And what we've also found is that aside from just this native revivalism, they do want to bring about a new dark age. In fact, Terence McKenna called himself a new dark age, or that he wanted to bring about a new dark age. And so, you know, we have that quoted in that article. But so neo-feudalism was essentially the agenda, get us all back into a neo-feudalist society. And then, as I discussed with General Stubblebine in that interview, and he admitted that Aldous Huxley, as far as he could tell, was in charge of MKUltra, I had discovered that it looked very obvious that Aldous Huxley was one of the key people, if not the head of MKUltra, directing the studies, etc., to be done. You agree with that statement as the former head of Army Intel. And can you give any information on what Aldous Huxley's position was?
I don't think I should.
But that whole thing, all, you know, the intel, all of that ties in together, and it kind of makes this nice little bow that they were using against us, trying to drive us, essentially using Huxley's Brave New World to recollide us into ancient Hindu society with the ancient Hindu caste system. The alphas, betas, deltas, epsilons in Huxley's book would become, you know, the Hindu caste society became Huxley's, you know, alpha, beta, delta, epsilon, etc. So this was the agenda, and this stuff goes all the way back to the Mahabharata.
I think that one of the things that Huxley was, it's difficult not to say huckster, but it's one of the things that Huxley was pushing was indeed the Western analog of the Hindu caste system. Another thing that he was pushing was mindless subservience for most of the population, Another thing that he was pushing was absolute and total social control of all biological and physiological functions, so that everything exists only with the permission and at the behest of the state. Mao was pushing that too. Hitler was pushing that too. Obama is now pushing that. Bush was pushing that. This
Stalin,
is transnational. Stalin. I'm sure Genghis Khan was doing it within the context of his own technological measure.
You know, I was just looking up Gregory Bateson in the brain database here, and he admits one of his largest influences is Aldous Huxley. We've got him under Harold Abramson. He's at the Macy conferences.
Harold Abramson gave him LSD for the first time.
Yes, exactly. And guess who he gave LSD to for the first time?
Now that I don't remember.
That would be Ken Kesey. Now we have in the online video a conversation about LSD where Tim Leary admits that they're all agents. He says our agents. He's talking about them driving around in a bus.
I think, you know, it's an interesting thing too. As you go around the country, I'm sure you all have this experience. You talk to middle-aged, fairly respectable people in Tucson, Arizona, and they said, this is where the acid thing really happened. Tucson. In San Francisco, this is where it really happened. The Lower East Side, you know, they say that's where it's really happened. And no one has ever really told the story what was going on in Los Angeles during those years. I think much more was done down here. There was a much wider range. There were more doctors involved. There were more scientists involved.
We had Gerald and Aldous.
Yes, right, yeah. And Ivan, of course. Then, of course, it was part of the coolness of the Los Angeles cell, whatever you want to call it, that they kept a, you kept a...
Well, you might not call it a cell. Let's call it a cluster.
Our undercover agents in Los Angeles were very cool about, and yet they did more in a very laid-back way. And it's never been as public as some of the other, you know, the buses running around the country paying.
Yeah, and then Zinberg says that the visionary experience and all the things he was doing at Harvard and the others, his residents and the rest that he was giving LSD to, they never had a visionary or an ecstatic or mystic experience, but the whole thing was a California invention. He said, and he said, and the only time it ever happened was when you crossed the Colorado River.
He meant, you know, obviously the bus being Ken Kesey, so we know Kesey's an agent, we know Leary's an agent. Here's Bateson dosing Kesey.
Hey, one of the guys, you can correct me here if I'm wrong, but one of the guys in the Grateful Dead is currently a member of the Bohemian Grove. Is that true?
I think it's three of them: Bob Weir, Mickey Hart, and one other possibly. So yes.
Oh, really? As many as three?
And Bob Weir, I've found videos of Bob Weir actually bragging about it.
What insights can you share with us about your performance at the Bohemian Grove?
Well, I'll tell you what, I don't talk much about the Bohemian Grove because, you know, it's a place that people go to get away from the spotlight. You know, a lot of relatively well-known guys are members of that club. Basically, it was founded 130 years ago or so by artists and writers, for artists and writers, and still, in order to get in, you have to have something to offer in that regard. A lot of the members are you know, successful entrepreneurs or businessmen of one sort or another, but they all have an artistic bent. The stuff you hear about it in the rumor mill is, while entertaining, I've never caught any virginal sacrifices. Anything kind of remotely like that. He's really had some interesting times up there. And, you know, there are a lot of movers and shakers in that club, and I enjoy the chance given my mindset, my Weltschmerz, if you will, I enjoy a chance to get together with those guys and knock a couple back and talk it down. One time I spent a weekend up there. I ran into a guy named General Bill Quinn, and we had a couple drinks together. We were sitting in front of a fireplace, and we just started telling. We fell in together, and we started telling war stories. He was the guy that Hermann Goering surrendered, not his sword, but basically it was a mace. He surrendered he sought out Bill Quinn, Wild Bill Quinn, who was also the original head of the OSS, which became the CIA. He was a very, very interesting guy. And we just went back and forth. We had a crowd of people gathered around us at all times. And we'd about late afternoon, we'd wander onto the deck where the fireplace was, sit down, grab a couple of drinks, and just start going back and forth. That kind of stuff, these kinds of meetings and stuff like that are only going to happen there. Or, it's the only place where you can almost be assured of, where I can almost be assured of meeting folks like this. So it's a great opportunity for me. It's also a great club. There's sort of an unwritten but hard and fast rule for membership: no jerks. And they have an entrance committee that they can sniff them out.
Well, Bob, those are great insights.
He thinks it's all pretty cool. They all run with the CIA groups, but of course Bohemian Grove from the Bohemian Club in San Francisco, that is actually the sister club of the Century Club in New York, the famous art club, quote unquote, and then that was run by Alan Dulles, and Aldous Huxley and Gordon Wasson were also there, and of course Gordon Wasson is the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, and which he stole from somebody else's research, John G. Bork from 1891, but all of these guys centered around either the Century Club or the Bohemian Club, etc. So we found a lot of this overlap, and we do know for sure that the Bohemian Club grew directly out of the Century Club.
Our speaker this evening has, to a very distinguished degree, what I like to think all Centurions have in some degree, and that is a very considerable curiosity about matters which, strictly speaking, are none of their business, or at least none of their main business. We number among our members one, for example, who, though his career has been devoted to the textile business, has written an authoritative book on American ferns, Mr. Cobb. But surely our member this evening has roamed farthest afield, and he is a banker, a Morgan partner who has traveled to the remotest corners of this continent and of Asia in search of mushrooms, and not just ordinary mushrooms, if there is any such thing as an ordinary mushroom, but hallucinogenic mushrooms. For 10 years, he took trips in the rainy season to the remote mountains of the interior of Mexico, and only he knows how many trips on mushrooms he took when he got there. He and the late Aldous Huxley, who many of you will remember as a member of this association, discussed at length the hallucinatory mushrooms, and both Huxley and our speaker have written about them. Like Huxley, Gordon Wasson was once a journalist, but he has recently done something neither Huxley nor any other journalist I have ever heard of has done. He has written a book which was so much in demand that it was out of print before it was published. Furthermore, it cost $200. It was called Soma, the Divine Mushroom. Gentlemen, Mr. Gordon Wasson.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Would you like us to remove this so that it's not in the way of the screen? Or not?
No. It's quite all
Let me
right.
sit down here, though.
Let me see whether in the next few minutes, 25 minutes, I think I'm allocated, I can convey to you some impression of the thrill, the intense excitement in which I've been living for some years.
Well, I did an interview with this other guy, I don't know, quite a while back, and he was apparently a big Deadhead from back in the day, a very big Grateful Dead fan, and he kept referencing them in the interview, and at one point said something to the effect of, "Well, I'm just glad that my band, wasn't part of that whole Laurel Canyon scene and don't have that taint." And I was, I hate to break your heart, Bud, but I'm pretty sure that Bob Weir is a member of the boat, and he was just like stunned, I just seemed to just completely burst his little bubble, and
sure.
Almost felt bad for having told him that. But, facts are pesky things, and the Grateful Dead, the association with Owsley, and there was a lot of weirdness surrounding them.
Sure.
At one point they moved down to Watts, with Owsley, and basically were running LSD trials out of some decrepit home in Watts that was right alongside a bordello, which exactly parallels what the CIA itself was doing at the time in San Francisco and elsewhere, was sort of using, these bordellos to run acid tests and stuff. And here we have the Grateful Dead going down to Watts, of all places, doing the exact same thing, not long, just months before Watts went up in flames, So, the Grateful Dead, they have some very tantalizing connections, to say the least. But he was under the impression that they were sort of, above all of that. But,
did you read our Manufacturing the Deadhead article that exposed their connections and how that was all manufactured? The whole look, dance, everything. Well, and I know you did hear my interview with Soupalakis recently.
Yeah, I did. Yeah, that was bizarre. I thought I might actually be able to pick up a few little last-minute facts to tack onto my book, but nothing she said had any credibility whatsoever. It was just mind-boggling.
Do you think that she was clueless, or do you think she's more of like a matriarch?
I don't know. It was hard to tell, without meeting her face to face. It was hard to get a gauge on what her agenda was. I'm surprised she even went on the air, kind of, but.
So that's where we get the idea from that Vito, whether or not he was aware of it, seems to have been a key person behind it. And then when you tell me that all of these agents and FBI and all of these informants are coming around, it either he had to have been an agent, or he was being used by them for his talents. Does that make sense?
Well, they were intimidated by him because they had some fear of his power, and they wanted to be on top of the whole thing, like, what's he talking about now? Where's he going? What are his ideas?
Well, why do you think they were worried about him?
Well, he would get on to the networks, like the Joe Pine show. He was on the radio and the TV shows for Joe Pine about 4 times each on each of those networks. And he spoke fluent Lithuanian to the head of KTLA, and there was kind of a friendship there. But the guy was later told by agents from Mayor Yorty's office that Vito would never be on KTLA again because of what he said on the Joe Pine show, which was innocent little things like girls that get pregnant when they're young, and instead of their parents jumping for joy that she, achieved the state of reproduction, they were upset about it and wanting to end the pregnancy. So the powers didn't like stuff like that. They didn't like him talking about, address your feelings about going into the Vietnam War when you were called up for service.
We cite you. The research of Dave McGowan has shown that the connections between military intelligence and the music idols that promoted drug use to America's youth were too numerous to have been accidental. Among the many examples, Frank Zappa was the son of a specialist in chemical warfare. Jim Morrison's father was Admiral Morrison, the same Admiral Morrison who oversaw the false flag Gulf of Tonkin incident that launched the Vietnam War, etc. But we can see that the entire thing is intentional public relations to keep people distracted with these false idols that the intelligence community sets up to, steer the people around. And now, Miley Cyrus and this nonsense being the latest creation of the mind control.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, they do very much appear to be manufactured, and it wasn't as obvious in the '60s as it is now. I mean, nowadays these people just come out of they just come down the pike like prepackaged with an image and a sound, and the Lady Gagas and the Miley Cyruses and the whoever else is out there, Beyonce's and whatnot. But even then, I mean, you look at someone like Jim Morrison, and you look at there's a picture in the book, in my book, of him from just a year before he emerged on the scene, where he's pictured on the deck of his father's ship, and you would never think that this guy in just a year would emerge as this iconic rock god. I mean, what you see is this very clean-cut, collegiate, conservative-looking kid, and then just a year later, there he is on the strip with the flowing locks and the leather fringe jackets and whatever, and this whole sort of image and sound I mean, it sort of become this larger than life character, literally like overnight. And it's astounding, to see the transformation that he went through. And what was that something that he himself felt the inspiration to do? I mean, he just decided to adopt that look, and it just has a very manufactured quality to it. And you look at the background of how these bands got together, and how quickly they were thrown together and provided with instruments and recording time and signed to contracts and all that, just like out of nowhere. I mean, these were like kids, this unknown kids that just flocked into Laurel Canyon from various parts of the country for no apparent reason, and next thing you know, they have all new instruments, and they have recording contracts, and they have studio time, and they have club dates, and I mean, within
60 years of their music being repeated nonstop on the radio as well.
I know, yeah, it's to this day. So yeah, it had a very, the more you look at it, the more it had a very, very manufactured quality to it, which wasn't perceived at the time. All these people were elevated to the status of like gods practically.
Sure.
And
just like I just quoted right now, that was the actual intention is to make them into gods.
And these were not just singers, songwriters, and actors. They were not just entertainers. These were people who were promoted to such prominence that they basically became the spokesmen and the de facto leaders of the generation of the whole sort of resistance movement, and they were positioned to be in that, in that sort of a position where they could have enormous influence on public opinion. And I'm pretty well convinced these days that no one that's in a position to have significant influence on public opinion is probably legitimate,
The film's storyteller is Daniel Pinchbeck. It follows him on his quest to find the new way forward so that a post-industrial world can flourish in harmony with nature. It argues that the future lies in both the application of new technology and an evolution in human consciousness. Quite controversially, it suggests that psychedelic drugs can play a role in bringing about this new mindset. It does seem like a throwback to the 1960s. The film grew out of a bestseller Pinchbeck wrote called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl.
We sort of took the ideas from that book but then extended it into more practical solutions like ecological design and ways to address the financial system. Then we talked about meditation and yoga. So I'm kind of like the narrator and the interviewer and kind of weaves the story together.
The film features interviews with experts and celebrities. The film's message won't be to everyone's taste. Some critics will dismiss it as new age mumbo-jumbo.
Do you think that the people who are participating in this documentary have very good practical ideas?
I think the way to solve the planet's problems at the moment is to think out of the box, and some of those ideas might seem a little crazy, but revolutionary ideas always have. They've seemed a little strange, but we need to be in that mode at this particular time.
Right.
I just I'm very skeptical these days. I don't think you get a soapbox unless you're part of the inner circle.
Sure.
I just don't think it happens. You and I can talk on some obscure, internet podcast or whatever, but
Exactly. You don't see me getting offers from NBC for $4 million for my podcast here,
Not anytime soon, no.
So I grew up with
maybe you shouldn't.
With parents who were hippies, and and for both of them, that's the best time of their life. Like that was the highlight of their life. My dad was an actor at the Berkeley Repertory Theater and the Magic Theater in Berkeley in the late '60s, early '70s, which is the '60s, right? And he was in the psychedelic movement. Did a lot of LSD, practiced free love, and it's like
He was on the campus when they got
biggest
attacked.
part. He met Jim Morrison. He was he saw the Beatles play. I mean, he was all about it. Still about it, frankly. And I grew up listening to all these records on vinyl, all the classics, all these MK Ultra classics.
Yeah, you've noticed like all that music has you turn on the radio now and it's the same as like when you were a kid, the same songs
it's
over
tough,
and over
and it's really
and
tough.
over and over and over.
That's true.
They're just trying to keep us in that 60s, early 70s phase, keep the drug illusion going,
But it's a nice
keep
reminder.
classic rock,
Right.
and then you discover that all of these bands are out of Laurel Canyon, and they're all the Sons of Intelligence, and then, Jim Morrison's dad is the one who launched the Vietnam War with the Gulf of Tonkin incident.
Yeah.
Admiral Morrison.
And then you got the song The End.
The End, and
all that apocalyptic stuff.
It's just loaded with. In my opinion, Gavin, what they want to do is get people to focus on their emotions rather than any actual skill.
Absolutely, which is why as well you would have had, very interestingly enough, with a lot of the late 60s stuff, the accentuation of the Dionysian over the Apollonian. The more emotive over the reflective.
Sure, and that's the same thing in the rock and roll music and all of this stuff, and you actually see it in the whole joke going back to music. Let's go back to what you just said, the Dionysian mysteries and rock idols, right? And then fast forward to modern rock and roll music and the rock idols, and you get the joke.
Yeah.
They're just playing on us. Oh, hey, look, this is how the ancients controlled the masses using these techniques. So this is how we're going to do
absolutely,
it. And but now we have, or they have, the ability to use radio and television and the internet to broadcast all of this mind control out, whereas before it would kind of stay localized.
That's true. And this is the thing is what you see with the changing media, because I was born in the 70s, and when I was growing up in Cork in the 80s, there was very, very little kind of you had one kind of mainstream kind of like pop station which played pop music, which I didn't really listen to because I was more into like 60s and 70s music. So there wasn't the sense of being bombarded as there is these days. I mean, you had to actually kind of because I was really into as I still am into a lot of the kind of 60s and 70s music, but I had to kind of hunt it out because it wasn't being kind of imposed upon me.
Sure. But now you know that it's mind control, so it adds this kind of extra layer of irony to it. It's like, well, I can enjoy this and tap along, but, what was the real agenda behind putting this music out? What is the agenda of keeping society caught in 60s and 70s music for the last, 50 years?
Yes.
You turn on the radio station now, you hear the same music over and over and over.
These two books aren't that far removed from one another, despite what it means. You think Laurel Canyon music scene, serial killers, not going to be much of a connection there, but there actually is, and I mean, Charlie Manson's fingerprints are all over the Laurel Canyon scene, I mean, he's throughout the book, but what I didn't know until fairly recently is that there was another serial killer whose fingerprints were also, not to the same extent, but, quite a bit. So, yeah, the whole peace and love scene was a little more bloody and violent than,
Absolutely.
than what we are supposed to believe.
So, going back to my interview with Dave McGowan and all of this, how did all of this make you feel? Did you get anything new out of that, or you were already on this track the whole time exposing all of this, or were you already aware that all of these serial killers were basically being created?
Well, with Dr. Wynn Michael Lordy, I have the proof that at least 4 children that came under his care starting at age 6 became serial killers. Richmond, Virginia has a lot of serial killers, but most of them are black. And as you know, black serial killers don't get the media attention.
4 people under his... What I wonder what are the chances? I mean, this is like... the woman doctor on Dexter in the last season or whatever, and her own son is a serial killer, and she's helping Dexter, and Dexter's girlfriend is a serial killer. I mean, what are the chances of one psychiatrist knowing 4 serial killers? Are you sure they didn't base the show Dexter off of your family?
I'm not sure. I do know that the information that I've gathered, the American people and people in general need to pay close attention. There's a game being played on all of us, and as humans, we need to become more aware. Once I became aware, my criminal mentality was completely erased. It's gone. And so therefore, I think that the more knowledge we as a people, the more knowledge we have, the more control we have over our faculties.
And auto-hypnosis is a taught trait. And I know that the CIA specifically used auto-hypnosis to see if they could get people conditioned so that they, for instance, I think the example they used was to be kept in filthy, terrible, uncomfortable, even, I guess, painful living circumstances, and that the person would just go into their own mind and not be affected by it, which, of course, reminds me of 6 months tied to a bed in a straitjacket. So there's some similarities.
Now, in my research on MKUltra, I've come across some interesting things. I want to read this to you. This is from Aldous Huxley's letters in a book called Moksha. And this is to Dr. Humphrey Osmond, September 23rd, 1956. Quote, our last experiment with, and notice he says our last experiment, and he's writing this to Dr. Humphrey Osmond. And he says, our last experiment with LSD in conjunction with hypnosis, the idea being to hypnotize participants and give them post-hypnotic suggestions to the effect that they would be able to reproduce the LSD experience at a given time or at a given word of command was not very successful so far as the hypnotic procedure was concerned. It may be that the suggestions, in order to be successful, have to be repeated on several occasions, or it may be, of course, that the effects of the chemical are not reproducible by psychological means. At any rate, in the majority of cases, what is interesting to me in the experiment was the fact that 50 gamma of LSD to produce in me virtually the full effect of the standard dose. Okay, and we see throughout Moksha that he's actually recommending these LSD hypnosis studies. Now, when we go to Acid Dreams, page 7, part of the quote there says, one of the CIA's professional consultants in H, quote-unquote, techniques, which I think is probably Huxley techniques, also questioned why, or it could be just hypnosis techniques in general, also questioned why hypnosis was attempted, quote, after a long and continuous use of chemicals, after the subject had vomited, and after, apparently, a maximum tolerance point had been reached with the chemicals. End quote. And then continuing, everyone who read the interrogation report agreed that hypnosis was useless, if not impossible, under such conditions. So this is twofold. One, we see Huxley actually recommending these studies, and we see an overlap between acid dreams and other MKUltra research. And so we know, here, and there's many other examples in Huxley's Moksha that he was actually involved in guiding MKUltra research. But two, here's this other statement by Huxley with hypnosis and LSD, and the doctors are complaining about it. Would you agree with this analysis, or from your experience, was it actually successful?
I think they had hypnosis down to a fine art. I think they do exactly. I mean, there's a lot of declassified material and stuff written about what do they call it? Rapid hypnotic induction. With it can be as simple as a finger, a cue with a finger, a particular word, a particular phrase. I think they know, and I think they probably, especially all these years later, I think they could hypnotize someone with a snap of the fingers. It reminded me when you were reading that. When I was talking about the Kennedy assassination, I didn't actually complete what I was going to say. Is when I had Curlin on the phone during the lawsuit, I talked to him, and he and I had an extremely disturbing conversation. I was trying to find out from him what happened. How come he knew I was in that seclusion room? He took me out. He agreed. He took me out. He agreed with all of it. And then he began to say some strange things to me. He said to me, you don't remember the Kennedy assassination, do you? And I said, yeah, I remember that. He said, you don't remember the Kennedy assassination, do you? And I said, yes, I do. I just said that. He said it the third time. 3 times in a row he said that. And I always found that to be very disturbing, that I think he was trying to do something there. I was never too sure what, but he was up to something. And when you read that, it reminded me of that. He was, I think, trying to gain control. And then he said something to me along the lines of, you need to get on a plane and you need to sit across from me and look into my eyes and let me buy you a plane ticket. He lived in California at that time. I said, no. He said, let me buy you a bus ticket. And I said, no, absolutely not. And again, it's just that exchange suggests the possibility of a hypnotic command. Which is why I think, my memory ends with him right at the door. And I have, 3 very, very brief memories of the man and nothing else. Gone. Nothing else.
My research on MKUltra, I have exposed a number of former agents in various areas, and we're always finding more. Essentially, once you figure out how the system works, it's not too hard to, I get that it appears that what a lot of this is based on, as far as intel and the mind is concerned, seems to be along the lines of Marshall McLuhan and a lot of these guys, and using the classical trivium, using logical fallacies and appeals to emotion, switching the conversation off to another topic with the red herring, all of these sorts of tactics. Would you agree with that?
Oh, yeah, it's part of the game.
That's part of the game.
Yeah, I mean, incidentally, they played that same game with me on many occasions.
So they play the game against their own, you're saying?
That's right. Yeah, they play the game, against me.
Well, why don't you define exactly what is the trivium and what is its importance?
Well, in a very disintegrated form, the three subjects which make up the trivium are part of what's called a classical education today, which very few of us get in this country. To the word trivium itself, it's Latin for the intersection of three roads. So it's a metaphor for the three subjects of the trivium, which are specifically general grammar, formal or Aristotelian logic, and classical rhetoric. Now, we've all heard of these subjects, but other than grammar, most of us really are unfamiliar with what these terms mean in their deepest sense.
Well, in 2001, 2002, I inherited the She Who Remembers audio archives. And in there were 70 hours worth of Terence McKenna audio, which was the first stuff that we put out on the internet. And I was studying all of that stuff back then as we were putting it out. But I started noticing a lot of problems in McKenna's work when I was writing my first book back in 2004, 2005, Astrotheology and Shamanism. Just a lot of inconsistencies in the work. Dr. Brian Akers has shown that his whole stoned ape theory was completely fraudulent, that he made up fraudulent citations to Roland A. Fisher, etc., regarding that stuff. But when we get into his background, we see that his largest influences are guys like Marshall McLuhan, who wrote his PhD thesis on the classical trivium, which is using the trivium for mind control rather than freeing people. And then we get into, and I've mapped out his whole background, but or not his whole background, but I've mapped out much of his background. And, he's tied into the Esalen Institute, which we've pinpointed as a center of MK-Ultra. He's also involved in selling cybernetics, which kybernetes is government control, or from the ancient Greek. One of his largest influences is also Aldous Huxley, who we've got just about nailed down now from his own works, that he was one of the directors or one of the top guys of MK-Ultra. He was also influenced by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, who is a Jesuit priest who came up with the Omega Point theory. And then the 2012 theory that he later promoted was actually developed by CIA agent, Professor Emeritus Michael Coe from Yale. And once we get that, and he's also selling transhumanism. He was at the Tussman Experimental College, some other stuff going on there. But when we understand that it was Julian Huxley working with the British Eugenics Society, one of Desjardins' books was provided a foreword or introduction by Julian Huxley.
Yeah, that's right. Get a big name to do the foreword, and that promotes the book. I mean, we still do it today, don't we?
That's exactly right. And in fact, Julian Huxley wrote the introduction to the 1950 or 60s version of Darwin's book.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, keep publishing Darwin's book, even though...
Teilhard de Chardin, he wrote, obviously he created the Omega Point, which is what the modern idea of the 2012 end of the world scenario that's supposed to happen on the 21st this week. That's where that comes from, is from Teilhard himself.
Yeah,
and then Teilhard appears to have been involved in the Piltdown hoax.
Yeah.
And he wrote a book called The Phenomenon of Man.
Man, that's right. Yeah, that was what I was trying to think of.
Okay, so how does he tie it all together? And he brings together all of these people from different churches and religious backgrounds to help sell this theory. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Is Julian Huxley working with the British Eugenics Society, who created these ideas of transhumanism and humanism. And also Terence McKenna was selling feminism, which we've done much to expose with, Karen of Girl Writes What. She's done extensive work to expose how the whole feminist movement was, again, to destroy this sacred masculine, to get people off balance, to focus on the wrong issue, and instead of being effective. And essentially the focus there is to destroy the family unit, because if you can destroy the family unit, there's nothing for people to fall back on as society collapses, etc.
Well, let me echo that recommendation. I've only recently encountered Girl Writes What, but absolutely, if really interesting research going on there. Again, there's so many different threads to this that it might be confusing for people who haven't read the article. So, of course, I'm going to put the link into the show notes, and I really do recommend that people go and read through the article and go into your previous research as well, including your research last year on Wasson. But why don't we go back to a point that I brought up at the very beginning of the conversation, and I don't want to let it go before we go, talking about the creation of LSD and the popular narrative of how that went versus indications that might not be the real story.
Sure. Well, next month, in fact, a friend of mine out of England, Alan Piper, is going to be publishing a new paper in the journal Time and Mind that actually reveals that in 1933, a Jewish novelist by the name of Leo Perutz published a novel called St. Peter's Snow, where in this book they are working with ergot derivatives of wheat to create a new, never-before-discovered psychedelic. And actually they do talk about how they go back through and they're studying the ancient mysteries and things and trying to figure out what it is. And then they say, well, we think it's wheat and this rye. But in the story, they're very clear that it's not a chemical that's found naturally in nature, such as LSA, which is found in morning glories, and ergot naturally can produce LSA, which is maybe 100 times less psychoactive as LSD. And so, there's only two or three. There's hydroxy LSA, and LSD. Those are the only possibilities for a hallucinogenic substance for this book to be talking about. So, by process of logical deduction, none that are found in nature, we automatically remove LSA and hydroxy LSA, and we're left with LSD. So in this book, they're using LSD 10 years before Hoffman supposedly invents it to create a new religion, to bring about, and this is a Jewish author writing about trying to bring about a Roman emperor to his throne. So, of course, more tongue-in-cheek stuff here. And then we have the storyline finishing with the chemist who actually invents the drug starting a communist revolution instead. And so, and when you see all of the tie-ins between communism and how they've twisted the psychedelic revolution without critical thinking, it all makes a really tidy package. And here this guy, he's either, magic and predicting the future, or he's a scion or something like that, and he's got an in, and he knows who's doing the research for real, and as is clear, because it really proves that Albert Hoffman could not have invented LSD, and that the whole Bicycle Day story is just part of the religion. And of course, that makes Albert Hoffman and Terence McKenna, Gordon Wasson, Timothy Leary, these guys just hierophants of this new dark age religion that they're selling.
Yeah, I think he definitely fell for a lot of poisonous ideas at some point, like the transhumanism part and a lot of New Age stuff. That's why I think it's so important for people to have active filters when they take information in, and not accept everything that anyone says. I've often said I don't agree with, even amongst people who I consider mentors for my own awakening, I don't take every single thing that they say and just accept it. You have to look at each claim that they make and then run it through a filtration system and see if it comes out the other end as holding true. So I think that's really one of the important parts of information, of truth discovery. And that's what really the trivium is a process of truth discovery. Again, certain things, if you take them wholesale, can lead to a state of imbalance, as you said. And part of that whole New Age agenda is to create an imbalance toward the feminine side of the individual, whereas the masculine side kind of dies away and the person won't stand up for their rights. It's very important to maintain that balance at all times and never to go into one form of imbalance or another, either becoming like a dominator who's bent on control or becoming someone who will just, accept everything and just let their rights be tread upon.
How useful this is, because now the citizen can see the events and see the trajectory of them, the goals, and then, like, if you get to the point where you understand 1968 Hollywood strip, right, where you just go, hey, I get it, these musicians, this music, Vito and the Freaks, these are all people working for the government. These are all people that are here to try to help us take drugs, to try to get us to behave in a certain way. Well, now when you go forward and you suddenly see Esalen, right? You see the same individual setting up the New Age religion, the New Age thinking. Well, how hard is it to understand that? Right. How hard is it to understand that? So this is why it's valuable to really try to take all of the citizens from, where you can see the plan clearly, where you can see the first beginnings of it, you can see how that's connected, and one place that people should be going to just religiously is Gnostic Media website to look at the brain. Because the brain, the software that Jan has developed will just help them.
I didn't develop it.
Well, but you've used it, but it'll help people walk right through it.
Yes.
You can walk right through to where you get to the 1968 Sunset Strip is understood, and then when you get to Esalen, which started the 72, something like that.
68.
Okay, well there it is. Well, then, but suddenly it's not. There's no. You don't have to work too hard.
No, it's all there.
Yeah.
It's all there if you want. It's a reference.
Al Hubbard was the sole licensed importer of LSD in North America, specifically in Canada. He was an American citizen. He was forced to relocate to Canada because he was facing congressional indictment for activities that he performed during the end of World War II. Chiefly which was to load boats and ship equipment from the West Coast, Los Angeles, San Diego, Seattle, loaded with uranium materials to England. And this violated certain federal protocols, and people in Congress found out, and he was under federal indictment. And with the help of then OSS apparatus, senior apparatus, he was helped to be given a Canadian citizenship and relocated to Canada and became a Canadian citizen.
How did you begin investigating him?
Like a whole lot of other people, I had read 2 books, and there are 2 books that you've read and that thousands of other people have read. The first being Acid Dreams by Martin Lee and Bruce Schlein. And the other was Storming Heaven, LSD and the American Dream by Jay Stevens. And I was living in Santa Barbara. I was back in Santa Barbara at that time after graduating from Arizona State University. This was 1989. I was back in Santa Barbara. I had been accepted into the master's degree in professional writing at University of Southern California. I had a full-time job in Santa Barbara, and so I commuted 2 nights a week to USC to attend classes in my first semester. I was taking a lot of LSD at the time, a lot, and a friend of mine turned me on to both of these books, Acid Dreams and Storming Heaven. I had never heard of them. They had just recently been published. I believe both were published in 1987, so this was only 1.5 or 2 years maximum after they were first published. But I had not heard of these books before. As an aficionado of LSD, I read both of these books, was just blown away at the subject matter and the intensity of the research that both Martin Lee and Jay Stevens had conducted in their respective books. But one character, one human being, one person out of all of the litany of people who are featured in both of these books jumped out at me, and that was a man named Al Hubbard. And he just jumped right out at me. And it was almost as if something supernatural was telling me, you need to know more about this man. Not enough has been done. There are fragments, there are stories, there are brief chapters in both books on Al Hubbard, but there was a lot more to know, and I was the guy to do it. And that was my obsession for the next 2 years.
So Al Hubbard was known as the Acid Messiah and the Johnny Appleseed of LSD. Why is that?
He was known as three things: the Johnny Appleseed of LSD, the original Captain Trips, and the Acid Messiah. Those are three titles that were conveyed upon him. Why was that? He imported all, and I am talking about all, of the LSD from Sandoz Laboratories in Switzerland to distribute to psychiatrists in the United States of America. So when you read about Carrot and Jack Nicholson and Stanley Kubrick and novelist Anais,
Well, we'll get to them in a bit, though.
Sure. All of that acid that psychiatrists dispensed to these very, very famous people came from Al Hubbard. Al Hubbard was the dealer. He was the distributor of the entirety, and I'm talking about 100% of the LSD that came into the Hollywood community in the very early days before the hippies, before acid was ever even talked about.
Sure.
Came from Al Hubbard.
You know, why don't we start off or give people a little bit of background on how I got into this area of research, and then from there we'll take it back to ancient Greece and then come forward. So back in originally in 2005, I published a book called Astrotheology and Shamanism, where we were looking at the history of drugs and astrotheology as a basis of Judeo-Christianity. In there, we published some primary ancient Christian documents from the 4th century. Church Father Epiphanius talking about how the suns or the birth of Jesus was based on the solar calculations around the Christmas celebrations. And so this was a primary document that essentially proved that. But while researching that, we came across a lot of the attacks that have been published out there for many years against the Dead Sea Scrolls scholar and famous or infamous author of the Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And the reason why, since 2009, I've been into his work is because with his daughter in 2009, we republished his book, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. But in from 2006 until 2008, I was investigating his background and all of these attacks that were published everywhere against him in the media by Gordon Wasson, in the psychedelic community, in the academic community. And we were going through, essentially myself and Allegra's daughter, and looking up each of the attacks and pulling up the original citations, seeing what he wrote and what the claims were against him. And what we found out writing that book was that a man named R. Gordon Wasson, who is the so-called discoverer of magic mushrooms, he launched all of the attacks against Allegro. So on doing more research on his background, I later discovered that he's the vice president of propaganda for J.P. Morgan Bank, etc. But anyway, in writing my book, The Holy Mushroom, that really, what we did was not only did we publish the first primary medieval Christian text specifically discussing the use of the holy mushroom in the Greek Orthodox Church, But we also published 41, there's in the color edition, I published 41 color iconographic images showing the mushrooms, and we did a line by line showing Allegro's claims, the attacks against him, and then debunking it. And we literally refuted every single attack against this area of his research regarding the sacred mushroom and the cross and any associations of mushrooms being used in Judeo-Christianity. Now, a lot of people will say, well, I've taken mushrooms, they're a spiritual thing, and there's no way that anybody could be using these for a negative thing. Well, when we begin to think of the Jewish and Christian churches being patriarchal churches, and then we begin to think of how now we have evidence that they were in fact using these things. In the book of Zohar, there's a reference to the red mushroom or red fungus being used there. And so we have references to these things. Now, these are patriarchal religions. So this should give us pause, which is what happened to me when I was writing these books, is going, now, wait a second. Are they for spiritual, or is there something else going on? So I want to make clear to the listeners, because I get a lot of attacks for this, and a lot of people will say, no, it was all blowback. All the CIA agents, they're just dumb dupes. They couldn't have done this stuff. And so, when we step back and we look at this other side of these things, that maybe they weren't just dupes and maybe this was intentional, then it shows us that the church used them for control. And going all the way back to bring up a point that you brought up at the beginning, we look at the Eleusinian mysteries. Now, interestingly, the word mystery means to mystify, to stupefy, to dumb down or control, essentially. So in the word, or in the name, Eleusinian mysteries, they're telling us what it is. And so I began looking at this, and back in 1976, Gordon Wasson, Carl A.P. Ruck of Boston University, and Albert Hoffman, who supposedly invented LSD, wrote this book, The Road to Ulysses, stating that, this was a society, an example of a society that was all based on psychedelic spirituality. Well, I began to look at it, and it turns out that there's two families that control the entire celebration at Ulysses. I forget their names in ancient Greek, and they basically kept control, and the government had control of this drug initiation for 2,000 years. And so, they'll claim that, it was it was a spontaneous thing that it managed to be kept secret throughout all of this time. Meanwhile, saying that guys like Socrates were killed for exposing it.
Listening?
I am listening.
Are you paying attention?
You mean me or them out there?
Them out there.
Gotcha.
Question is, can we wake up? We're asleep. What's the percentage that is even aware of what's going on? It's trivial. Let me tell you something. Time to wake up. It's time to take off the coverings and throw away the distortions and see, understand. Again, get the blinders off your eye. Get the earmuffs off your ears so that you're understanding exactly what's going on and where you're headed. Because if you don't do that, you're going to be taken in and suddenly you're going to be a slave. Now, do you want to be a slave or do you want to be a free person? Your choice. And the time is now. Right now. You better get the earmuffs off and the eye blinders off and see and hear what's really happening so that you then can make the choice of which do you want to be, free or a slave. Choose.
Quote, whoever, under color of any law, statute, ordinance, regulation, or custom, willfully subjects any person in any state, territory, commonwealth, possession, or district to the deprivation of any rights, privileges, or immunities secured or protected by the Constitution or laws of the United States, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 1 year or both. And if bodily injury results from the acts committed in violation of this section, or if such acts include the use, attempted use, or threatened use of a dangerous weapon, explosives, or fire, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 10 years, or both. And if death results from the acts committed in violation of this section, or if such acts include kidnapping or an attempt to kidnap, aggravated sexual abuse, or an attempt to commit aggravated sexual abuse, or an attempt to kill, shall be fined under this title or imprisoned for any term of years, or for life, or both, or may be sentenced to death.